Hello, my name is Dr. Gabriele Maier. I'm the Extension Veterinarian for Beef Cattle Herd Health and Production at UC Davis. In this presentation, I will be discussing the health of cattle affected by wildfires. So, as I'm sure you're aware, 2020 has been a really bad year for wildfires in California. It's now only October, and already 8,500 fires have burned over 4 million acres. And that corresponds to over 4% of the land area in California. Much of it is where cattle have been grazing. A quick fix to this problem does unfortunately not seem to be within reach. So we have to do the best to be prepared for future fires. There are a lot of different resources available online that give you ideas on how to prepare for a wildfire. And clearly, some of the fires in the recent past have moved very, very fast, and even the best preparation may not have led to a better outcome, but it is still a good idea to make sure that you're not completely caught off guard. So these guides will tell you about defensible space around buildings, how to make sure your animals can be identified if they get moved or commingled with others during a fire, what items to have on hand or stored, or what copies of documents to keep in a safe location or in the cloud. So some examples are the Ready Egg workbook on the left from Penn State. There's in the middle here, there's a handout on animal evacuation from CAL FIRE. And on the right here, there's a more generic guide on evacuations, but there are many, many more. But what I would mainly like to discuss is how cattle health is affected if they're in a fire or close to a fire. So one of the issues is smoke inhalation. Smoke contains very small particulates, much smaller than dust particles. And they can make their way far into the lungs of cattle if they inhale smoke. Particulates can lead to eye irritation and respiratory tract problems. In severe cases, smoke inhalation can lead to what's called pulmonary edema, which is fluid buildup in the lungs. Cattle that are affected by this will cough, they have rapid moist breathing, and you may see frothing at the nose. More chronic cases, so after a few days, cattle can develop a bronchopneumonia, so a more classic respiratory pneumonia, respiratory disease pneumonia. And that's partly because of the smoke, but it's also precipitated and exacerbated by the stress of being in a fire. How severe this is and whether they recover depends, of course, on the level of exposure that they've had and on the underlying health of the animal. So what can you do if your cattle have been exposed to smoke from a wildfire? The items on this list may seem very basic things to do, but they're nonetheless extremely important. Don't work your cattle unless it's absolutely necessary. Give them rest as much as possible. Fresh water will help them keep their respiratory tract hydrated, and that helps with the healing. And if you're feeding hay or any other dusty feed items, make sure that you spray it down with water first to limit any additional particles that they could be inhaling. Also, spray down the ground to limit dust buildup in the air. So, as always, your veterinarian should be the one consulted if you're worried about the health of your herd or individuals in your herd. So remember that you will need a prescription from your vet for antibiotics. And if you treat with antibiotics, that there will be withdrawal periods before animals can go to slaughter. It can take quite a while for cattle to recover from smoke inhalation. So complete recovery can take up to 4 to 6 weeks. So give them some time. Cattle can also suffer from skin burns during a wildfire. If you find severely burned cattle, they unfortunately need to be euthanized. Vulnerable areas for burns on the body include the udder in cows. So if you see burned teats or singed teat ends, you should check their functionality to make sure that calves are still able to drink from them. Burnt faces or muzzles may lead to a reluctance to eat. So when that happens, you can soften the food by soaking it in water before feeding to encourage eating. Often extreme heat will lead to separating of the hoof walls from the foot. So if cattle have to walk on burning ground that's really hot, it may cause that to happen. And there will be a delay, so this may take a while. You may see this after 1 to 3 weeks following the fire. Um, so if you see lameness in cattle at that time, then inspect their feet. If you see separation of the hoof walls, this typically happens at the coronary band. That's unfortunately a bad prognosis, and most of these will end up having to be euthanized. It's important to assess cattle often during the days and weeks following a fire. The damage can show up after a while. So, as I mentioned, the lameness can show up after a week or so. And cattle can seem fine at first, but then stop eating. So, it's important to frequently check them. If there are burn wounds, then try and keep them as clean as possible. One thing that you can do is apply insecticide around them to avoid fly strike. And then remove dead tissue as necessary so that new tissue has a chance to grow in. There are options to treat burn wounds with ointments. So talk to your vet about those, as well as pain medications that you can give, whether antibiotics are needed, and which animals need to be euthanized or culled. Be sure that your bulls undergo a breeding soundness exam before the next breeding season if there was a fire. While this is always a good practice, it's especially important after fire. So testicles, the penis, the prepuce, they're all very close to the ground, so they can suffer burn injuries, and that can cause fertility issues. Also, consider that if cattle are commingled with others during an evacuation, there is an increased risk that bulls become infected with trichomoniasis, which is a chronic venereal disease that is, if bulls become infected, they have to be culled. If you do have to euthanize cattle, make sure that it is done safely and correctly. So be familiar with the landmarks on the head and which firearms and calibers to use. For the landmarks, if you draw an X from the outside of the eyes to the horns, or where the horns would be in a polled animal, um, if you draw an X where the lines meet in the middle is where you need to aim. There's a complete description of this in the BQA field guide that is freely available online, and I refer you to read through that. Also, do not underestimate the psychological toll that it may take on you if you have to euthanize one or even several or many of your animals. And do not feel ashamed to reach out if you need help. Also, keep in mind that if you lose your pasture in a fire and you have to switch to alternative feed sources, this may result in gastrointestinal problems because of the sudden switch to a new diet. Feeding plain hay is the safest, and then you can slowly add higher energy feeds such as dried distillers grains or soybean hulls. So mixing that in is a good strategy to keep more animals on feed with less amounts of feed. Smoke damaged feedstuffs are often not well tolerated by livestock. So offer that in limited quantities as tolerated. At this point, we do not have evidence that falling ash or runoff from wildfires or even semi-urban fires offers a toxic risk to livestock. This is based on testing that was done on water samples and forage samples close to the campfire near the town of Paradise, which was destroyed in a fire in 2018. However, if you are concerned about toxic residues, if you want to test your forage, testing is available at the CAVS lab, that's the California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab, and other commercial labs. Thank you for your interest in this topic. I hope you and your cattle stay safe from fires. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at gumaier@ucdavis.edu. Thank you.